All right, welcome to part 2 of our segment related to early Renaissance art and architecture. We've been hanging out in the city of Florence and have been looking at some important structures. Hopefully you recognize Brunelleschi's dome. We're going to be looking at some other important civic structures. What you're looking at right now is the Orsa Mikau, which is the granary shrine of Florence. This was an important building. It provided food for the city of Florence in times of famine. You can see it's a very rectangular building with arches that were originally open at one time. The building has burned down twice and been rebuilt, so that's why it's been sort of closed off and these windows have been added. Major guilds were given a niche, which I'm pointing to over here, to place a public sculpture that represented their patron saint. Guild systems were a very important economic function during the Renaissance. You had certain guilds that would band together, so like blacksmiths had a guild, goldsmiths, armorers, and they would publicly fund works of art and try to do public funding measures to better their city. So again, this relates all back to this idea of civic pride and civic identity. What we're looking at is a statue carved by Donatello of St. George. Donatello was very good friends with Brunelleschi, who we talked about in our last segment. He carved this statue for the Guild of Armorers and Sword Makers in Florence. It would make sense that St. George was the patron saint of the Armorers Guild, as he was a very well-known military figure. And remember, he was also very well known in the Byzantine, and we have seen some references to him in Byzantine art. So when we look closer, we're going to study this. This is a really important work of Donatello's. It isn't part of your 250 works, but it is an important one for you to understand the other works of Donatello that are on that list. In Donatello's work, St. George was carved as a confident figure. He stands tall with his shield in front of him, and it looks as if he could rotate it on a small base the way he has it positioned, which touches the ground. This implies at the very least a sense of readiness on the part of the saint to quickly confront enemies coming from different directions. What looks funny about the anatomy of this figure is that he has a very long torso and short legs. So that's one thing you might have noticed when you were looking, that maybe the proportions weren't classical in that sense, that his torso did seem a bit elongated, and his legs seemed a little bit stunted. This was done intentionally because Donatello knew a lot about optics. The guild originally rejected it when Donatello presented it. So Donatello was designing this sculpture to be placed up, where viewers would be looking up at the niche. So the work, when he showed it to the guild, was not placed in the niche yet. Donatello agreed to fix it, but instead he went ahead and just placed the sculpture in the niche for the next presentation to the guild. So he didn't make any changes. The guild, when they saw it, they loved it because Donatello knew that the proportions would appear correct when placed in the niche, because the viewers would be looking up. So again, we're looking at artists using science, observations of science, and incorporating this into their art making and trying to make art more illusionistic and real and imitating nature. So we're comparing this statue to one of the earlier Greek jam statues from the Cathedral of Chartres, just to kind of compare and contrast. And note how the figure of St. George, his legs are spread out. He's not quite in contrapposto. The figure originally held a lance, you can see here, that extended into our space. So again, this is something that you might want to compare and contrast with this earlier Gothic representation of St. George from Chartres Cathedral. And this is something I want you to do on your own. You do need to be sort of making these cross currents and being able not just to regurgitate the material, but again, sort of compare and contrast. You will have free response questions where you might have to plug in works of art, and this would be actually a good comparison and contrast when confronted with a question like that. When we look closer at his face, we see that he is depicted with a very alert stare and a youthful face, again very idealized, going back to these sort of classical ideals. And then at the bottom, this is called a predella. This is the base on which the statue sits. And it's also interesting the way Donatello does relief sculpture as well. In the predella below, we see how he shades and molds the relief sculpture almost by scratching into the form, which is unusual. He does play around with this idea of illusionistic space by having a very sharp receding background. This relief is more scratch than relief sculpture, so both raised and recessed parts have this sort of scratching technique. You definitely can see it here. And again, this does give it a sense of illusion and depth. And it almost looks like a painting. And so we had talked about this earlier, that sculptors will reference painters and painters will reference sculptors during this period. He's also observing light and how it passes over forms. So we do get a sense of the modeling and making these figures seem more three-dimensional. So Donatello really had a great understanding of human movement and anatomy, which is going to be one of the sort of stylistic conventions of Renaissance art to come. Now, this is a work that you are responsible on your list of 250. This again is by Donatello, and it's a figure of David. So the subject of David is really important because it represents Florence's civic pride. Again, the Duke of Milan had tried to take over the city of Florence. And the story of David references this liberation and freedom cherished by the Florentine people. If you think about the story of David, who was a young shepherd boy who slayed a great giant Goliath. So it's very symbolic in that way. And so there's this idea of the underdog winning, which was a very similar situation to Florence and Milan and their rivalry, because Milan actually was a much bigger and a more powerful city-state. This is a statue done in bronze. It was originally thought to have been commissioned by the Medici family for the palace courtyard, and it depicts a very youthful King David slaying the giant. The figure is nude, but he wears a shepherd hat and boots. So this is unusual. The nude figure is very classical, but I think with the inclusion of the hat and boots, I think for some people they find it a bit uncomfortable, and it maybe kind of eroticizes the figure a little bit more. But I think Donatello was also just trying to contrast sort of textures with the laurel wreath and the hat and the hair and then the smooth skin, and then you have the boots. And, I think he was experimenting in that way. This is also important for you to understand this work because it's one of the first bronze nude statues since antiquity. We really haven't seen a bronze statue since the Greek and Roman times, because they had all been melted down. And Donatello was very much aware of this, and sort of, again, referencing this Greco-Roman classical tradition. And this is another statue. We're not studying this one. That was done a little bit later, around the same time. This is Verrocchio, who was also a sculptor, and this is his version of David. And it's just interesting to sort of compare and contrast the two. So take a moment and you can do that on your own, but obviously, this figure is clothed, this figure is nude. There are some similarities in that the figure seems, pre-adolescent and sort of prepubescent. He's sort of this sort of man-child figure. And I think Donatello, was really pushing the edge of his a little bit more, especially with the eroticism. Here's a close-up of the torso and the head. David is depicted staring down and appears sort of lost in thought. He wears a laurel wreath around his shepherd's hat. And this is a pagan symbol. This is a symbol, an ancient symbol of victory. We're going to be looking, and this is a good example of figure in, sculpture in the round. So we're not looking at sculpture that is part of architecture, that's part of, a church facade, but, sculpture on its own. The figure of David stands atop the severed head of the giant he's slain, and he's in a very exaggerated contrapposto stance, and he almost has this S-curve that really, again, enhances the sensuality of the figure. The figure of David also seems very feminine and androgynous. And again, I mentioned he's depicting David before puberty. Donatello was said to have studied the anatomy of young adolescent boys, and so he's probably incorporating this knowledge. This most certainly evokes a kind of eroticism that contrasts with the civic importance of the piece. And it is important to, for you guys to understand that a lot of artists and male, there was this idea of homosexuality that was accepted during this period of time. Obviously, it's accepted now, but back then it was accepted, and often an older man would mentor a younger man, and so I'm sure Donatello probably engaged in this. So this has been quite a controversial piece. It's thought to be a private commission, and probably that's why the sexuality and eroticism of the figure is so pronounced. We may never know all of its meaning, but it's interesting how, the city of Florence really embraced this as a civic sculpture of pride. The sculpture actually was made public after the Medici family got kicked out of Florence. So it was originally a private commission, but then when they kicked the Medici family out, the city of Florence made it a public commission and really used this metaphor of David and the struggle that David went through to sort of represent the similar sort of struggle between Florence and Milan. And then here's a detail of the feet. And again, some art historians have pointed out that, David appears to sort of be rubbing the beard of this decapitated giant that he's just slain. Again, sort of alluding to the eroticism of the sculpture. And then here's a detail with the feather of the helmet, again, sort of, coming up from the head of Goliath's helmet, and again, sort of sensually coming up in between the legs of the figure of David. So again, it is a very erotic, sensual sculpture, and it was intended to be that way. So it does really represent a significant shift from the medieval, really quite a significant shift from the medieval figures that we have been looking at related to when we looked at Gothic sculpture. Remember, Greeks really loved the body. They embraced the nude body, while Christians were very shameful of it. And with early Renaissance painting, we have seen this new embrace of, some classical ideas and more acceptance of nudity in infusing these classical ideas with religious themes, which is what Donatello has done with his sculpture of David. This is our next work of art. This is by Alberti. We had talked about him earlier. He had actually codified Brunelleschi's linear one-point perspective, and we're going to be looking at a villa and house that he designed. Here it is with the actual title. I have forgotten to put that. So again, Alberti, the Palazzo Roccia, built between 1446 and 1451, and you note with the blue star it is one of your 250 works. Leon Battista Alberti was born in Genoa in 1404. The first theorist of humanism art, Alberti belonged to an important Florentine family that had been exiled from Florence since 1387. When the family returned to the city in 1429, Alberti gained access to the city's great architecture and art, which he'd studied extensively. Well versed in Latin and Greek, Alberti never received a formal architectural education. His architectural ideas were the product of his own studies and research. In 1446, Leon Battista Alberti, whose texts on painting and other architecture established the guidelines for the creation of paintings and buildings that would be followed for centuries. So he codified and wrote these theories down related to art, and Renaissance art in particular. And so when we look at the design and the facade of this building, we really do see how it is very, very different from the medieval style, and really quintessentially Renaissance. The Palazzo Rucea, again, was constructed between 1446 and 1451. This was the home of an important family, a wealthy merchant family. And this was just one of many important commissions that Alberti would complete for the Ruceas, who obviously, and that's something else, a lot of these artists would work with a patron, and in many ways they would keep commissioning works of art with them, and in many ways help support their career. The Medicis did it, Rucea did it with Alberti. So like traditional Florentine palazzi, which is a home, the facade is divided into 3 tiers. But Alberti divided these with horizontal entablatures that run across the facade. Remember, an entablature is a horizontal space above the column or pilasters. The ground tier grounds the building and gives it a sense of strength. This is achieved by using cross-hatched or rusticated stones that ran across the very bottom of the building, as well as a large stone block and square windows and portals of post and little construction in place of arches. So it really does provide more of this sort of base and sort of structural support. It's a little bit more severe in style than the other 2 tiers that we'll look at. The overall horizontality of the facade is called trabeated Trabeated architecture, which Alberti thought was more fitting for the home of nobility. So each tier also decreases in height from the bottom to the top. On each tier, Alberti used pilasters or flattened engaged columns to visually support the entablature. On the first tier, there is a Tuscan order. On the second and third tiers, Alberti uses smaller stones to give the feeling of lightness, which is enhanced by the rounded arches and windows, a typically Roman feature. But of these tiers, they also have pilasters, although on the second tier there is an Ionic order. So right here. So this Tuscan order, Ionic order, and then on the third tier is a Corinthian order. So remember those, so instead of columns, he's using these pilasters, but he's incorporating these sort of capitals that are very reminiscent of the 3 architectural orders that we talked about with Greek architecture, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And hopefully, what does this building remind you of? Where there was a similar Roman structure that also incorporated this sort of 3-tiered system and this sort of change and use of these architectural orders. Can you think about it and remember? So hopefully the Colosseum from ancient Roman art came to mind, and Alberti was definitely referencing this building. And remember the arches, the use of the arches, and then the change in the architectural orders. More of a Doric order here, simpler style, the Ionic, a little bit more decorative, and then the Corinthian at the top. So I have no doubt that the college board probably will probably have you compare and contrast these two works of art. And just to clarify about the pilasters, I got a little muddled when I was talking earlier about the second and third tier. They both use pilasters. They just use different capitals or different orders. So this one, the second, uses Ionic, and then the top uses the more decorative Corinthian order. Let's see. The building also is wrapped by these benches that serve, as they do now, to provide rest for the weary visitors to Florence, which is a nice addition and touch to the structure. So here we're looking at another view of the building, and I really want you to think about the influence of ancient Rome, and again, in many ways, of how this building is very similar to the Colosseum, which Alberti did see in Rome during his travels in the 1430s. And I just showed you a picture. The great Roman amphitheater, is also divided into tiers. More importantly, it uses architectural features for decorative purposes rather than structural support, like the engaged columns on the Colosseum. The pilasters on the facade of the Ruccia do nothing to actually hold the building up. So again, these are more decorative features, but again, you can get a close-up of the building. And that is our last work of art related to early Renaissance sculpture and architecture. So this concludes part 2. In our next segment, we'll be focusing on the High Renaissance. We'll be looking at superstar artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. So stay tuned.